few days ago, I was finishing Marvel's omnibus collection of the Dark Horse series Knights of the Old Republic by John Jackson Miller. I hadn't read this series since it first released between 2006 and 2010, and other than the fact it still stands as one of the all-time great Star Wars stories, a comment by Miller reprinted in the back of the book, originally from issue 48, reminded me of a place I spent a lot of time as a kid and teenager, and how I ended up contributing to a published Star Wars story in the expanded universe. In issue 48 of Knights of the Old Republic, there's a major revelation about one of the main characters in the series. The good guy Mandalorian we all knew as Roland was actually an evil character named Demogol, who had been wearing Roland's armour since an early story arc where they, unbeknownst to the reader, switched places. Miller goes into detail about how they wrote the fake Roland to give subtle hints about their true identity, and notes that how early on the so-called switcheroo had been guessed by a member of the Dark Horse Comics forum. Been an active member of the Dark Horse forum since sometime after the release of Attack of the Clones, probably from when I first began collecting the US Star Wars comics as they were released each week. The first issue I bought brand new was Republic 54, released in June 2003. Read lots of Dark Horse Star Wars comics before this and had a modest collection of trades, but with the Clone Wars multimedia project in full swing, I really didn't want to miss out on anything, and the Republic series was really hitting its stride at this time.
Begun this Clone War has.
It became a highlight of my week to go to Space Center in Sheffield or Forbidden Planet to pick up the latest comics and read them on the way home. I didn't know anyone else who had anywhere near the same passion as I did for this stuff, and Star Wars definitely wasn't something you'd openly discuss at school if you wanted to at least try to fit in. For me, joining an online community of Star Wars fans really helped me. I was able to connect to other fans all over the world, made some real-life friends, and it boosted my interest in the medium even more. It's one of the few times growing up where I really felt like I belonged. Probably being biased, but I don't think there was a better community of Star Wars fans at the time. Other forums, like the official Star Wars website's forum, was far too strictly moderated, and the Force.net's Jedi Council was overpopulated and had so many sub-forums it was difficult to navigate or keep up with everything. This was long before social media really took off, so it wasn't unusual to find companies hosting and cultivating their own discussion forums for fans to engage with each other and their IP, rather than relying on those same fans to set up and moderate their own communities on third-party websites where it would be more difficult to monitor and interact. I have some great memories of my time spent discussing Star Wars with other fans, including some who are still very much active in the fandom today, as well as the Dark Horse editors, notably Randy Stradley, Jeremy Barlow, and creators such as John Ostrander, Jan Duursema, John Jackson Miller, and so many others over the years. Of course, the forum did have its rules, one of which was you weren't allowed to post fanfiction. This was because Dark Horse didn't want to get sued by someone claiming they'd ripped off their idea, which would be difficult to argue against had it been posted on the very own website. This was also consistent with Dark Horse's submission policy, where any stories or artwork based on one of their licensed IPs like Star Wars or Alien wouldn't even be read. However, it was on this forum that I'd made an offhand suggestion that it would be cool to see a Star Wars story similar to the movie Zulu, which told the true story of the defence of Rorke's Drift by the British Army against an onslaught of Zulu warriors. This concept of a technologically superior force becoming overwhelmed by attacking primitives was vague enough to be taken on board by Randy Stradley, and after I was asked to send a brief private message disclaiming I had no intellectual rights to the idea, The story eventually appeared in Empire issues 16 to 18 in 2004 and written by Wells Hartley, who was later revealed to be a pseudonym of Stradley himself. There was no mention of my minor contribution in the issues themselves, of course, but I did get credit on the forum's FAQ, and eventually on Wikipedia. Although I had nothing to do with it, this story arc was notable for being the first appearance of a character that would later turn out to be Tank, one of Luke's Tatooine friends mentioned alongside Biggs in the original movie, but never seen or mentioned again in any of the subsequent films, books, or comics.
You must understand I need you here, Luke. But it's a whole nother year. Look, it's only one more season.
Yeah, that's what she said when Biggs and Tank left.
Where are you going?
Looks like I'm going nowhere.
Although I was extremely proud of my suggestion helping to influence what turned out to be a great story, I wasn't the only member of the forum to contribute in some small way to the comics Dark Horse was making. Some members had variations of their usernames immortalised or memorialised as Jedi casualties of war in Republic 76 in 2005. I seem to recall I was quite jealous of that, actually. I also remember something from an issue of Star Wars Tales that made reference to a forum user called Darth Nuke, whose entire online identity seemed to be based around a suspiciously overly masculine perception of Mandalorians. And this was before Karen Travis's novels really popularised the Mandalorians. I remember the Dark Horse editor's response was to tease him with the idea of a pink Mando, which actually doesn't seem quite so ridiculous now. I think the pink Mando was one of the most recurrent in-jokes on the board, and along with a bizarre obsession with K'Kruk's hat, something that made its way into the wider consciousness of the Star Wars fandom. Wherever Darth Nuke is currently, I do wonder how he feels about having an entire TV universe based on the Mandalorian culture, or whether he's even still a Star Wars fan. In hindsight, though, maybe Dark Horse should have listened to him.
I got out of that business because people fuck you over. Jon Favreau? Faggot cocksucker tried to steal my ideas.
Miller's mention of the roller golf theory just shows how much the creators were paying attention to us, and the great relationship they had with fans on that forum and in general. A lot of us were sent preview issues for review, months before release, so we could write in letters for the column. I still have my preview issue of Knight Errant #1, the series Miller did after Knights of the Old Republic, and I've just recently confirmed, thanks to someone who didn't give most of their comic book collection away, my letter found its way into the print edition. In recent months, I've been reading Dark Horse's earliest Star Wars comics, such as Dark Empire, classic Star Wars, and the original Tales of the Jedi. And the letters columns are genuinely fascinating as a piece of Star Wars' sociological history. They document fans realising that there were still other fans out there after the dark times of the mid to late 1980s. When they each took on the licence, Dark Horse and Bantam Books likely didn't realise there was so much more life in this franchise that had lain dormant for years outside of role-playing circles, and I don't think they could have done a better job of bringing it back to life and stoking the fire for the special editions, prequels, and a whole new generation. Dark Horse's letters column also saw fans connecting with each other more directly, as back then they'd print people's full home addresses, enabling readers to write to one another. One letter in particular caught my attention. They wrote in to say how much they wished there was a place fans could connect like they do in the column, but all the time, essentially predicting the internet forums that would develop soon after. The happiness that radiates from these letters, the sense of people finding where they belong, reminds me of the era a decade or so later. I was experiencing exactly the same feeling. Because real life, responsibilities, and other growing interests finally caught up with me, sometime after the hugely disappointing Clone Wars was released in 2008, I began to fall away from Star Wars and pretty much stopped collecting the books and comics. As such, I began to spend less and less time with the online community. and eventually it was announced that Dark Horse would lose the license to make Star Wars comics, and Marvel would take over from January 2015, something that had been expected since the announcement of Disney's purchase of Lucasfilm back in 2012. The Dark Horse Star Wars forum understandably shut its doors forever. Not only a victim of changing licensees, but of changing times. Nowadays, fans and creators don't seem to have the same sort of spaces to interact with one another. Social media isn't a professional environment overseen and moderated by the company whose products are being discussed like many web forums were. They're personal spaces where creators can express themselves religiously, politically, and in other ways that would likely be considered inappropriate to do on the website of the company they work for. Thus, it's very easy for creators to alienate fans. Then influencers are quick to jump on the controversy in order to generate their own engagement and drive even further division into the fandom. I don't know, perhaps one day enough of us will miss those spaces that someone will bring them or something similar back, but I suspect the world has moved on for good, and our nostalgia for the good old days of Star Wars and our memories of the communities that existed are just that, nostalgia. I hope that fans growing up now get to experience the same nostalgia about their own good old days, but it feels like Star Wars and the fandom has both grown and shrunk under Disney, which is difficult to explain, but it certainly seems like a very different place now, and I don't find it a fun place to be anymore. I mean, maybe the older generation felt the same about us, I don't know.
Welcome to the new world. Welcome to the new world.
In any case, I hope you've enjoyed hearing about my minor contribution to the Star Wars Expanded Universe, and if there's anybody from the Dark Horse forum watching, I hope you're doing well. And thank you to Dark Horse, Randy Stradley, Jeremy Barlow, and everyone else for being such an important part of my early years on the internet. It might seem ridiculous, but I do genuinely miss that era of the Star Wars fandom,